another edition of this season of the History Lecture Series. My name is Michelle Meyer. I'm the producer. I'd like to acknowledge a couple of people before we get started. Dr. Curtis Manning is behind our camera. He's the gentleman who created this organization. And he still inspires me till this day. And then I'd like to announce that our speaker's family has joined us all the way from Tennessee and Alabama. So thank you for coming with me. Thank you to all of you for braving the storms to be here tonight. I'm sure you're not going to be disappointed. Tonight we're going to talk about something that is incredible in our history and goes a long way back. And we have a special interviewer with us. Ms. Alyssa Arnell is with us from the National Park Service. She's been with them since February, but she has a background in history and legal history, which I never thought was out there, although I worked at college. Shame on me. She is the outreach coordinator down here at the battlefield, at Shama Battlefield of the National Park Service and also Park Ranger. And she is willing to do this lecture for us that I feel like is so important to our history. So without further ado, I am going to bring up Ms. Alyssa Arnell.
Hello everyone. I'm sure you can hear me there. I'm very honored to be here with you this evening to talk about the Buffalo Soldiers and a bit dry now, so you have to forgive me.
It's okay.
Anyway, I've been with the National Park Service, as Michelle said, since February. And one of the first projects I was tasked with was to create a interpretive bike program that focused on the Buffalo Soldiers for the Bike Easy in New Orleans. They wanted to come out. And during that research, I went through the logs. We have over 14,000 soldiers and family laid to rest in the Chalmette National Cemetery. And luckily we have very good records, and they indicated that we have over 100 Buffalo soldiers, or actually 99 soldiers, indicated as Buffalo soldiers in the cemetery. What I found interesting about identifying them, one of my former students and I went through for the program, we planted flags at each one of the headstones, the Buffalo soldiers. And unlike some of the regiments, like the USCT, United States Colored Troops, where they might be kind of collected together in one area, the Buffalo soldiers were spread across the entire cemetery. And I think that's just a testament to the real impact the Buffalo soldiers have had in our history. Because there's a legacy before the Buffalo soldiers and a legacy afterwards. But the bridge between the past and the present with the Buffalo soldiers gives us, I think, is pretty important. Of the 99 soldiers that are indicated as Buffalo in the cemetery, 62 died in the first year and a half of organizing, from the spring and summer of 1866 to the winter 1867. I'm not sure that they actually were sent out west. We do know that Jackson Barracks was used during Reconstruction for African American troops, and I'm thinking that some of them might have passed there due to yellow fever and cholera, because we do have evidence of that. But getting down to the nitty-gritty, in 1866 we have the organization of the peacetime troops, and this allows for the opportunity for African Americans to engage with military service post-Civil War. I think it's appropriate that we're talking about this now. This is the 150th anniversary of the Congressional Act stating in 1866 an act to increase and fix the military peace establishment of the United States. And this legislation allowed for the organization of 10 cavalry soldiers on horseback and also 45 infantry. And out of that, we have 2 cavalry regiments that are African American, and we have 4 regiments of infantry that are then consolidated in 1869 into 2 infantry units. In recognition for their work during the Civil War, all the effort and bravery, the radical Republicans went to task to ensure that they would have representation in the military. And I think it's important to speak a minute about the role of Radical Republicans when it comes to the organization of the Buffalo Soldiers, because without the efforts of this part of Congress post-Civil War, we would probably be looking at a very different race relations now as it stands. The Radical Republicans were responsible, and this is the original Republicans Party of Lincoln. They were responsible for the passage of the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, and incidentally, in the Chalmette National Battleground, we actually have a Freedmen's Cemetery as well, thanks to the Freedmen's Bureau. And as well as all of those accomplishments, the Radical Republicans also pushed for the Buffalo Soldiers. And they came up against opposition within the Republican Party, as well as the Democrats, when it came to integrating, as well as just giving the opportunity. So although the Radical Republicans, led by Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts, had hoped to see an integrated army, they were at least able to establish the 6 regiments. It's important to note that as well, the 13th Amendment was the amendment that ended slavery. The 14th Amendment is the one that grants citizenship, and the 15th was the one that gave the vote to all male citizens, regardless of race, right? And I think it's a significant moment to talk about that as well. The earliest legacies of the Buffalo Soldiers comes again from the valiant efforts that they made during the Civil War once they were allowed to engage. Over 180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army. Over 33,000 lost their lives at some of the bloodiest battles in the Civil War. Comes to mind is Cold Harbor. And if you know the crater, that was a pretty devastating battle as well. But through these events, Black soldiers were attempting to prove their value, to show to mainstream America that they deserved equality. And this is a struggle that the Buffalo Soldiers will take that legacy, and they will continue that struggle forward. Black troops before the Civil War were also important in creating that kind of legacy. Of course, we know about the American Revolution, but in and around New Orleans, there was a very special and significant Black militarization that occurs. We see the first African Americans, slaves and freemen of color being armed in 1729 here in Franklin, Natchez. And part of what is significant in this area is that if you were a slave and you were able to fight for the French or for the Spanish, that was probably the quickest way to manumission, which is, of course, the quickest way to be freed of bondage of slavery. And so we see African Americans being equipped and militarized in the early 1700s. We see it again under Spanish rule against the British in the American Revolution. And what comes out of that is a new legacy, a congressionally legislated freemen of color battalions. And this becomes a very significant group of men that fight with Andrew Jackson here at the Battle of New Orleans. And it is the first time in American history that we see both Black and white troops fighting side by side, freemen of color fighting with side by side with white troops here at the Battle of New Orleans. So it's out of this legacy, the Civil War, all the way back to even before the United States was established as an independent country, that African Americans were seeking their freedom through militarization and protection of the country or countries, depending on what time frame we're talking about and where, that they lived within. Besides that, we have the origins of the Buffalo Soldiers in 1866. Initially, they were established to help support Western expansionism, and I find it very interesting when you look at the major accomplishments of the Buffalo Soldiers. Western expansion, Manifest Destiny, and then the Spanish-American War, which is the real push of American imperialism. But out of that, we have a very honorable legacy as well. The Buffalo Soldiers were split, the cavalry in the 9th and the 10th, and then 9th Cavalry was initially assigned to support and ensure that Native Americans were removed from the locations on the east and basically with the Trail of Tears out to the west. Meanwhile, the 10th Cavalry went immediately to the west and immediately into war with the Indians, the Comanches, and the Texan frontier, and the Cheyenne, and the Central Plains. Early engagement in 1867 with the Cheyenne were very bloody. Even though there had been a peace on the Great Plains from the Treaty of Little Arkansas from 1865, this treaty allowed for assigned lands reservations, basically, in Texas and Kansas for Native Americans. Unfortunately, those states did not recognize those reservations. And so there was a tense peace at best. And we have the withdrawal of the federal garrisons because of the Civil War. So what that meant was, during this period of time, the Native Americans had an opportunity to reclaim their lands. So by the time that the 10th Cavalry actually arrived, they were met with a fierce and organized group. But it's out of that fierceness that respect was born on both sides. And I have to wonder, it's an interesting thought to think that you are a recently freed slave, or you are a soldier, a black soldier in the United States Army, fighting for a freedom that you really didn't have access to. And now you're being tasked with the removal or fighting other people of color who were also trying to protect their lands. That must have been a very difficult thing to address. So when we talk about the respect and the idea of the Buffalo Soldiers, it comes out of those engagements. The earliest engagements in '67 in the spring in Kansas with the Cheyenne, the Buffalo Soldiers found themselves, Company F, found themselves being encircled by Indians more than they could actually fight. They dismounted and fought on foot until they were down to their last bullets, and they remounted and shot their way out. In the fall, of '67, in Company F, it was Private John Randall and 2 citizens. They were at an encampment not too far from Fort Hays. They went hunting, and 70 Cheyenne came and attacked them, and the 2 citizens died. But Randall took several arrows and escaped. The Cheyenne then turned on the encampment, and once again, these cavalry dismounted and began to attack on foot, even though they were encircled. And they actually pushed the Indians back after wounding and killing about 15. And it was out of that bravery that they earned the name of Buffalo Soldier, a spiritual animal, because even in the face of larger numbers, they did not back down. Even when pierced with an arrow, they did not fall. And so the 10th Cavalry immediately accept this honorable identity and make it part of their coat of arms as well. And soon afterwards, the 9th and the 24th and 25th also adopted it. They were brave, carrying out campaigns through the West for dozens of years, decades actually, and over 177 engagements in the Indian Wars alone. And keep in mind, we're not talking about a cavalry and infantry that is given the highest respect in the federal government. We're talking about soldiers who were given horses that are near lame, rations of food that are in poor condition to begin with, clothing is the same, and yet still the Buffalo Soldiers persevered. This map shows the expansion of Western protections under the Buffalo Soldiers. We see from 1860 and 1870 all the way up to the 1900s. So we're talking about 4 decades. And what they accomplished during that time is really phenomenal. and also it's been pretty much a footnote in history for quite some time. It's only recently that we're seeing a true acknowledgement of the Buffalo Soldiers. I have been doing a lot of research, and it's come to my attention that a lot of the histories that are inclusive in the narrative of the accomplishments of the Buffalo Soldiers were written in the last like 2 decades. But we do know that they did accomplish a lot. They were sent out westward. They were the first troops out. They built the infrastructure that would be used later by the white cavalry. But we're talking about building roads and erecting the telegraph lines. Those telegraph lines are first text messaging, right? They were escorts and guards to stagecoaches and mail, cattle drives, railroads, surveyors. And you think about, the Wild West, there were lots of criminals out there, and there was a lot of racism as well. So when the black soldiers, the Buffalo Soldiers, would go into these frontier towns, just attempting to do their job and to protect those from this lack of lawlessness, they too were then attacked, killed, and so even when they were trying to help others, the racism still came through. They engaged in settlements of strikes, faced down again these lawless men, and most interestingly to me, 75% of the western forts were built and manned by Buffalo Soldiers. Most of Arizona and New Mexico was mapped out by Buffalo Soldiers. They went out first, finding those watering holes, again, making sure that the infrastructure was put down so that the white cavalry could move in. The Buffalo Soldiers have had many different experiences that I find very fascinating. There's the 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps as well, under 2nd Lieutenant James Moss, who believed that walking was too slow and that horses were too expensive, and that perhaps biking was a way that the Army could save money and yet still travel at a good clip. And so this Louisiana native and West Point graduate established the first bicycle corps. And so what we know is that the Buffalo Soldiers become the first professional mountain bikers as well. Under his leadership, they rode 126 miles in 4 days on their initial first journey out. And the longest trip they took was about 23 days and 800 bicycling miles from Fort Missoula to the Yellowstone National Park and back. It's quite a trip, if you ask me. And you think about, the kind of ruggedness. We're not talking about New Orleans paved streets. Well, I guess here would be kind of an obstacle in itself too. I had a bike out there. I bought myself a helmet as I moved here. But you think about the accomplishments of the Buffalo Soldiers, and how long they spent out west. The question then becomes why? Why would you spend so much time out west? Well, what's back home? Back home, you have the question of whether you will have a future of freedom. And we know the racism existed there. After Reconstruction, it's very quickly that we see laws and segregation emerging. So you're fighting racism to the west, it's behind you. We know that the black codes lead to Jim Crow, and it's here in our own area that Jim Crow is institutionalized with the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. But more importantly, I think that the idea is that fighting out west, the Buffalo Soldiers are still proving to mainstream America that they are more than simply 2/3 a person. And if you think about, again, I really can't stress this enough, the type of work that they're engaged in, both physically but mentally, right? The distinction that they served in the Indian Wars and the Spanish-American Wars and World War I and World War II, I think that it goes without saying that the legacy that they were trying to carry forward. And it's not as if they were making a lot of money. In the 9th Cavalry, those who joined were making $13 a month. Of course, course, you did also have food and clothing and shelter. And if you consider that during Reconstruction in the South, that might be an actually pretty good opportunity, considering that many people were wandering and trying to find an existence. But again, they were allocated the worst of everything. And again, they had to face discrimination regardless. San Juan Hill. There's a picture here that I'll talk about that I brought in at the end here, but we go from the Indian Wars, where Western expansion comes on the hoof, behind the hooves and feet of the Buffalo Soldiers, and we turn our attention to the Spanish-American War. Now, Buffalo Soldiers came back from the Indian Wars, and America loved them, but they're still armed black men, and that makes people uncomfortable. So when there's a chance to, once again, focus their attentions, the government takes that chance. The U.S. Troops declare war against the Spanish after the sinking of the U.S. Maine. They believe the Spanish might have done that, or it may have just been a cause to go to war. But the question is, did the Spanish act? And it culminates into attacks on San Juan Heights in July 1st of 1898, led by Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt. He comes with his own media and reporters that are there to write a narrative of his success. And definitely that happens. But although the narrative is written to say that Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders rise to the top of San Juan Hill and defeat the Spanish, in fact, there were several hills that had to be taken. And in fact, it was the Buffalo Soldiers that came to the rescue. There were about 500 Rough Riders with Theodore Roosevelt. They get blocked off early on, and he loses about a third of his men. But it's the 9th and 10th Cavalries that come to his rescue. And also a biracial battle occurs at El Cane. And then in San Juan Hill, Roosevelt doesn't actually get to the top of the hill until the fighting is over. What I find interesting about this picture, and I was taking a minute to think about it, is that the definition here says, well, the description says that Roosevelt and his Rough Riders were at the top of the hill, which they captured. And in many of these photos, all you see are the center people, right? Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. And the Buffalo Soldiers are cut out. Like I said, there's a legacy of making the Buffalo Soldiers into a footnote in history. And I think that's important to note, because as we move forward to a more inclusive environment, we have to reconsider our narratives and reconsider the way that we address the past. Working for the National Park Service has been a very special experience, because what I've learned is that one of the goals of the National Park Service is to incorporate diverse voices and different stories, so that when you come out to the battlefield, or go out to Barataria, go to Yellowstone, wherever it might be, you can find your own voice, find your own stories there. And for us as a country to make that happen for the National Park Service and for all of you visitors and for all of us, we have to think in larger terms when it comes to our historical inquiry. And so we have to go back and look at those footnotes, like the Buffalo Soldiers, and consider why it is, as much as what actually happened, why it is that there are these footnotes. Let's see, there we go. There's a book called The Roughest Riders by Tussle, and he talks about what happened at San Juan with Roosevelt, and all the Buffalo Soldiers came to his rescue. He did them a great disservice. In the book, Tussle notes that the roughest riders that Roosevelt talked about were not the Rough Riders of his collective, but they were actually the Buffalo Soldiers to begin with. And in his book, he narrates the change in the discourse that occurs about the Buffalo Soldiers and their efforts at San Juan Hill by describing how Roosevelt actually changes his narrative over time. He begins in his own book, Rough Riders, by contributing the success of the Spanish-American War to the Buffalo Soldiers, saying they were indispensable in the war and that they were, quote, an excellent breed of Yankee fighters. But then later, he softens his praise and said that the Buffalo Soldiers were typical soldiers for the time. Then, even later, he says that they only performed their duties well because they were peculiarly dependent on their white officers. And then later on, even further, he says that the Negro soldiers, not Buffalo soldiers now, the Negro soldiers were shirkers of their duties and would only go as far as led by white officers. So why? Why do we see this kind of change in the narrative? Roosevelt receives a recommendation for a congressional medal that he actually receives later, posthumously in 2001, but 25 Buffalo soldiers were awarded certificates of merit for their effort. And even a Rough Rider, Corporal, said that, quote, if it had not been for the Black Cavalry, the Rough Riders would have been exterminated. So why take away the recognition? This is the point. We cannot talk about military history in a vacuum. So when you come out to the battlefield, you spend some time with us, I hope that you will think of a more inclusive narrative. We can't distinguish one historical narrative from the larger context, is the point. As a legal and social historian, I'm not sure if you're aware, but military history is not my forte. However, to talk about the law, you have to talk about politics, and there is military history. To talk about social history, you've got to look at race and gender issues. And so we see here as well the same outfitting when we talk about the Buffalo Soldiers, because we can't look at them in just this small way. It's one narrative. But Roosevelt basically wrote those changing narratives to uplift his own image as his political advancement occurred. And yet, the Buffalo Soldiers still fight on. There are a few reflections that I found in my readings that I thought were pretty interesting. Frank Schubert delivered a paper at a 1998 conference for Army historians in Maryland. He says, quote, about San Juan, finding the middle where the truth sometimes rests requires you to know the edges. When it comes to responsibility for the victory of the United States Army at San Juan Heights, Cuba, on July 1st, in 1898, the edges are easy to find. One side, there is the Teddy-centric view, first and most clearly expressed in the writings of Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, and on the 1st Cavalry, Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, the legendary Rough Riders. Roosevelt's memoir of Cuba so emphasized his own role that the book should have been called Alone in Cuba. The thing about the narratives is that when you look at something written by someone with an agenda like that, again, that footnote becomes quite large. In the Buffalo Soldiers, we have 99 in our cemetery, and from that journey, I have found so many different avenues to reflect on them. They were also the first national park rangers. Before we had a national park established in 1916, the Army was responsible for protecting those parks, and the Buffalo Soldiers engaged in that protection in San Francisco and Yellowstone and Sequoia. Their accomplishments are pretty impressive. They created the first usable road through the Great Forest, the first trail to the top of Mount Whitney, which is the tallest peak in the continental U.S. One Buffalo soldier, Colonel Charles Young, a Kentuckian, and the first African American to graduate from his high school, the third to graduate from West Point, becomes one of the first African American leaders in the military of Buffalo Soldiers, but also the first superintendent of the National Park Service. And the ongoing legacy for us at the parks, and I think for African American history at large, is that there is a larger meaning even now that can be taken from the Buffalo Soldiers. Dr. Lassard of Texas A&M wrote that of primary importance is the fact that the Buffalo Soldiers participated in mainstream American processes, the expansion of the United States and its populations, and the displacement of Native peoples. At the same time, because of white racism and discrimination that it spawned, they performed their duties and lived their lives of soldiers under conditions that were peculiarly trying. And this is very important because remember, they were supplied with inferior resources, but they persevered to the point where when they were out west, the Buffalo Soldiers regiments had the lowest amounts of desertion and the highest Medal of Honors of any regiment in the face of all of those obstacles. Paul Arnell gives a different perspective. Like I was saying, we see a change in the narrative that comes up in more recent times. But those footnotes, they're easy to find. Arnold, who has been praised for his 6-part series on the Buffalo Soldiers, wrote in that same series that, quote, the Negro soldiers in the United States, it is unnecessary to go into detail in regard to the service of the Negro troops in the West. The infantry was mainly engaged in garrison duty, the cavalry and Indian fights, none of which were very important. It's that simply put that the contributions of large portions of our population are written out. Lieutenant Hutchinson of West Point, who did not serve with the Buffalo Soldiers, he was still appointed to write a manuscript about them, and he described the early recruits as woefully ignorant, entirely helpless, who knew nothing and had no independence, self-reliance, not a thought except for the present, and were filled with superstition. Some were so helpless they had to be taught how to care for themselves, and in the same breath, he gives credit to the white officers for assuming nearly all of their duties. The officers, he says, were the ones who took care of everything. It was, of course, the regulations that the officers were all white. And the research and stories of the Buffalo Soldiers have only recently begun to expand, like I said, but we do have different narratives that we can look to now. Lieutenant John Bigelow, who was a soldier and a prominent historian of the 10th Cavalry, has written, and now his voice is heard larger, I think, in the historical record. But he emphasized that the colored men sufficiently educated to fill the positions of non-commissioned officers, clerks, and mechanics, and other security men who would be a credit to the regiment. In other words, in response to the idea that those who joined the Army post-Civil War were, that same kind of narrative of helpless people was a lie. 40% of the men who enlisted in the 9th Cavalry out of Louisiana in 1866 had prior military service, 10% were artisans, and 87% were under 25. So many of them were engaging not only for an opportunity for adventure, to escape racism, but also an opportunity to be educated. So what's the value of examining all of these different narratives? What's the value in historical inclusivity? I think that our history is made of a very beautiful, deep, rich cloth woven of all of our histories. One narrative does not exist without the sum of the other parts. When we examine one type of history outside of the construct of the larger fabric, we lose value in our past. We can actually discover the legacies of the Buffalo Soldiers without considering racism and considering those hard concepts, difficult as they may be. And I'll point out that I think about these things as I'm writing and researching for this and other events, because it is those difficult conversations that we have to have in order to actually move forward and heal. And the National Park Service is willing to have them with you. But again, we cannot really take the Buffalo Soldiers out of that footnote in history and make them larger if we don't. And it's not just about the Buffalo Soldiers, is it? It's about all of us. This is a picture of my grandfather, Benjamin Arnell. And as you can see, this is a certificate that says that Benjamin Arnell is serving in the United States Army in the defense of his country, World War II. He was not a Buffalo soldier, although there were Buffalo soldiers who fought during this war with him. But they came back, like he, to a country that still treated him as a second-class citizen. He came back and could not go and sit in a restaurant. And that was 50, 60 years ago, surely. But that was 100 years after the end of slavery. And in the 40s and 50s, the legacy of slavery was segregation, to the point that men can take up arms for generations and still cannot be equal. Then I task you with answering the question of what is the legacy today of the 40s and 50s and that segregation that we experienced then. Is it really, truly, completely over? I think the Buffalo Soldiers, we know that there are still regiments out there, although the traditional narrative on Buffalo Soldiers says that they pretty much ended with the integration of the Army in 1947, 1950. But I wonder, when we still have troops identifying as Buffalo Soldiers, we have motorcycle clubs, an honoring of that memory, what else that means for us. And we can talk about that if you have questions. This picture is a representation of the painting or the print that you see down there. It's titled Charge of the 24th and 25th Colored Infantry and Rough Riders at San Juan Hill. It was originally printed in July of 1899. That is an original print by Kurtz and Allison chromolithograph, I can't say it. Anyway, Kurtz and Allison were inspired more than they were concerned with the accuracy in these pictures, but they're also known at the turn of the century to be groundbreaking in their depictions of African American military in strong roles. And so this is a narrative that kind of debunks the Roosevelt narrative of San Juan Hill. And my grandmother has kindly allowed us the opportunity to view a first edition print, so it's here in the front if you'd like to look at that. That being said, I'd like to end, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. Questions? Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I have two questions.
Okay, Anthony.
One is, but they really have a bicycle corps?
Yes.
They did?
Yeah, in the 1890s.
Went around on the streets or something?
No, it's out in the west. It was just over the grass and ground.
That sounded kind of unusual. That's why I thought of that.
The whole thing is unusual to me. All right?
Second serious question. Why are they called buffaloes?
Because when they fought against the Indians, they fought with bravery. And many Native American tribes saw the buffalo as a spiritual animal. And so the texture of the hair kind of represented that. But again, buffalo is hard to take down. It's a strong, powerful, brave animal. And so when the buffalo soldiers did not back down in the face of troops that were twice, 3 times their numbers, and when they were attacked and still stood after being pierced by arrows, the Native Americans gave them that title.
Thank you.
Yes, sir?
Do you have listings of names of the various men who fought, their personal stories, their family information, list of descendants, people who can honor those people from a very, very personal way?
Are you talking about the buffalo soldiers in the cemetery here?
Beyond that, beyond the larger picture of the Buffalo Soldiers in general.
Yes, there are various databases that you can research for that. We have the names and some information on the Buffalo soldiers that are buried at Chalmette National Cemetery. I have found that it is difficult, though, to uncover some of those histories because many of the Buffalo soldiers come out of slavery. And so a lot of those records just aren't as comprehensive as I know a lot of us wish they were. But I can give you my card and I can make some suggestions on places for you to explore if you're interested.
Thank you.
Yes.
Were the Buffalo soldiers assigned to the Audubon Park area during the Civil War?
The Buffalo soldiers were out west.
Out west, so there were none here in this area.
Not that I'm aware
No one asked the questions?
A couple of questions. You mentioned the pay that the Buffalo soldiers were receiving at $13 a month. I was wondering how that compared to other cavalry units in the U.S. Army at the time.
of. That's an interesting question. From what I saw, the other regiments in the area were like $17 to $21 starting off. So it's a pretty vast difference there.
Any more?
Yes, Kyle?
I would just comment that the 9th Cavalry did muster from Kentucky and Louisiana. That's where the soldiers came from, and they did in camp in New Orleans in the fall of '66 and the spring of '67. So before they moved out west, some of them went to Texas or Kansas, but they did muster and camp during that formational period that was mentioned. So maybe it was as the unit was forming, they camped within the greater New Orleans area. I'm not sure where.
We do know, like I said, we do know that there were African American troops during the construction of the Jackson, probably pretty close by.
I might add that, military basic pay as a soldier or an airman or seaman, 100 years later, in the 1960s, rose quite a bit to about $113.50 a month, the basic pay, for a private. But 100 years earlier, I guess $13 a month was it's not all that much either.
By the way, the two gentlemen who were talking are actually National Park Service employees as well. And they've been working here a lot longer than I have, so they're kind of showing me up right now.
We call those ringers.
Any other questions? One more? Okay.
As far as the salary is concerned, I've been doing some research recently, and one of the contracts that I have written here in Louisiana is for a nurse. That nurse received $8 a month, room, board, 2 uniforms, 2 civilian dresses of her choice, 1 half day off each week, and particular holidays listed. $8 a month. So that $13 a month might have been a pretty good deal. And this was an 1867 contract.
And so in 1867, we see a disparity in pay between men and women. Yes.
Also wondering, at what point did any of the Buffalo soldier units or other regiments have sooner?
There were some black officers that rose in the ranks, but that was not until probably I want to say 1890s. So they did, but the majority, when they first went out, they were all white. And it was very difficult to get white soldiers to actually take those positions. And Custard actually turned one down, and later the Buffalo Soldiers saved him and his troops, and actually they say, well, I'm pretty lucky that he didn't actually take it after all, right? So.
All right. Thank you so much, Alyssa. Ladies and gentlemen, as promised, very interesting lecture. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you all for being here. Just as a footnote for you, there's a sign-in on the back table for anybody who wants to be added to our mailing list. We prefer email, but we will put it in the snail mail if you'd like it that way. And we hope to see you next month when we'll have something about George Washington Carver. All right? Good night, everybody, and thank you.